Okay, it really is good to be back. I know it's Memorial Day weekend, and we need to think about the reason we celebrate this holiday, and have the ability to do that. And, some people have different thoughts about how we're opening the country right now, and I have mine, and I'm thinking it's time to reopen. And, so not that we didn't do some things we needed to in the past few months, but, those are past and it's time to reopen, and I am very happy, that we're back here. And so, today's lesson is out of Luke 23 verses 32 to 43. And the title of today's lesson was Grace to the Dying Thief. And so I passed out some sheets here just to sort of give you an idea where we are. This is a story that everybody knows. I mean, Jesus in the beginning with the disciples, he gave lessons a lot of times that were particularly talking to the Jewish priests that were difficult to understand, intentionally, very smart the way he handled answers to them. But this is pretty simple at the end, and it's how we get into his kingdom. But the reason I brought this up is just sort of get the setting, somewhere between 30 and 33 AD. If you look at it, this all started in the upper room at the Lord's Supper, and then Jesus goes over to the Mount of Olives at the Garden of Gethsemane, and he went there to pray after the Last Supper. And so after that, that's when it all started coming down. He was arrested. He was taken over to Caiaphas's house, and he was judged by the Jews. They took him up to Pilate, and even Herod was in town, so they took him back down there, and then back up to Pilate to be sentenced to death. At that time, he was taken out over to Golgotha, which it's interesting, in the Aramaic that means skull, and Calvary is also what they call it, and that's Latin for Calva, which means bald head or skull. And basically we understand that this was a skull-shaped hill in Jerusalem. So I set all this up to sort of let you know where our lesson starts today, because it's the crucifixion with Jesus and the two thieves, one on his right side and one on his left side. So sort of let you know where we are. Let's go ahead and get started with the scripture. And I'm going to start with, like I said, chapter 23, verse 32. Jesus is placed on the cross. Two others, both criminals, were led out to be executed with him. When they came to a place called the Skull, they nailed him to the cross. And the criminals were also crucified, one on his right side and one on his left. And that's pretty important, because before this happened, when James and John asked Jesus for the places of honor next to him in the kingdom, he told them then that they did not know what they were asking. And that, if you go back to Mark 35:39, it's interesting, and I did that. So I went back to Mark, and then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came over and spoke to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do us a favor. What is your request? He asked. They replied, when you sit on your glorious throne, we want you to sit in places of honor next to you, one on your right side, or we want to sit next to you, and then one on your left. But Jesus said to them, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering I am about to drink? Are you able to be baptized with baptism of suffering I am baptized with? Oh yes, they replied, we are able. Then Jesus told them, You will indeed drink from my bitter cup and be baptized with my baptism of suffering. But I have no right to say who will sit on my right or my left. God has prepared those places for the ones he has chosen. When the 10 other disciples heard what James and John had asked, they were indignant. So Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers in this world lord over the people, and the officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you it would be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be a servant. And whoever wants to be first among you must be the slave of everyone else. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and give his life as a ransom for many, us. I thought that was very interesting. Here, as Jesus was preparing to inaugurate his kingdom through his death, the places on his right and on his left were taken by dying men, criminals. As Jesus explained to his two position-conscious disciples, a person who wants to be close to Jesus must be prepared to suffer and die. The way to the kingdom is the way of the cross. And, you know, we talk about how bad things are today, and people are hungry to get power without putting the effort into it. Not that John and James didn't do their work for Jesus, but they wanted the glory without putting the suffering in. Verse 34, Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. And the soldiers gambled for his clothes by throwing dice. Jesus asked God to forgive the people who were putting him to death, Jewish leaders, Roman politicians, and soldiers and bystanders. God answered that prayer by opening up the way of salvation even to Jesus' murderers. Jesus was suffering in the most horrible, painful death ever devised by sinful man, and he looked at the people responsible for his suffering and prayed for their forgiveness. And I thought about that. You know, this lesson we've heard since we were children in Sunday school. Can we do that? Could I do that? Right now, you could probably think of something in your life where you've been wronged. I was trying to think of that. Could I pray for their forgiveness? You try to, but you know, that's even hard for the best Christians to do that. You know, I know a lot of great people, and it's hard for anyone to do that. But Jesus did. The Roman officer and soldiers who witnessed the crucifixion said, this man truly was the Son of God. Going back to Matthew 27, verse 34, I'll go back to that. If you go back to Matthew in 27, verse 54, the Roman officer and the other soldiers at the crucifixion were terrified by the earthquake and all that happened. They said, this man is truly the Son of God. But it took a lot of earthquakes and I guess proof in the pudding that he was. Soon many priests were converted to the Christian faith. Because we're all sinners, we all played a part in putting Jesus to death. The good news is that God is gracious. He will forgive us and give us new life through his Son. Roman soldiers customarily divided up the clothing of executed criminals among themselves. When they gambled for Jesus' clothes, they filled the prophecy in Psalm 22:18. And so we're basically in the New Testament right now, but I did go back and look at Psalm and the prophecy of it and tying the Old Testament and New Testament in there. And there you go, short verse, but Psalm 22:18, they divide my garments among themselves and throw dice for my clothing. And so, you know, that was in time of King David, and he already knew. Verse 35, the crowd watched and the leaders scoffed. He saved others, they said. Let him save himself, if he is really God's Messiah, the chosen one. The soldiers mocked him too by offering him a drink of sour wine. We just heard about that with John and James. They called out to him, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." A sign was fastened above him with these words, "This is the King of Jews." And everybody knows that was sarcastic and mockery. This sign was meant to be ironic. The king stripped of his stripped and executed in public view, had obviously lost his kingdom forever. But Jesus, who turns the world's wisdom upside down, was just coming into his kingdom. His death and resurrection would strike the death blow to Satan's rule and establish Christ's eternal authority over the earth. Few people reading the sign that bleak afternoon understood its real meaning. But the sign was absolutely true. All was not lost. Jesus is the King of the Jews and of the Gentiles and the whole universe. Verse 39, one of the criminals hanging beside him scoffed, "So you're the Messiah, are you? Prove it by saving yourself and us. And while you're at it, go ahead and save yourself." But the other criminal protested, "Don't you fear God even when you've been sentenced to die? Come on, we deserve to die for our crimes, but this man hasn't done anything." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "I assure you today, you will be with me in paradise." And again, I've heard this lesson since I'm old enough to remember. You start talking about Easter and the Last Supper and the crucifixion of Jesus, and it starts making a little more meaning when you hear that last verse. Let me read it one more time and start thinking about this. And Jesus replied, this sinner, "I assure you today, you will be with me in paradise." This guy's lived a horrible life and he's about to die. And Jesus has promised him a seat in heaven. As this man was about to die, he turned to Christ for forgiveness, and Christ accepted him. This shows that our deeds don't save us. Our faith in Christ does. Our deeds do not save us. It's our faith that does. It is never too late to turn to God. Even in his misery, Jesus had the mercy on this criminal who decided to believe in him. Our lives will be much more useful and fulfilling if we turn to God early. But even those who repent at the very last moment will be with God in paradise. The dying criminal had more faith than the rest of Jesus' followers put together. Although the disciples continued to love Jesus, their hopes for the kingdom were shattered. They're that day, standing there that day, watching everything, and some of them left. It's over. Most of them had gone into hiding. As one of his followers sadly said 2 days later, "We had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel." By contrast, the criminal looked at the man who was dying next to him and said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." By all appearances, the kingdom was finished. How awe-inspiring is the faith of this man who was alone, saw beyond the present shame to the coming glory. He was ahead of his time. And so when I go back to that last verse that we talked about today, that thief, that dying man who created so many sins, was going to be in paradise that day. It brings me back to something that I try to live with, and I didn't always do, but I'm trying to do it better now. It's, if we're true fishers of men, then we're not to judge over past actions of ourselves or others. I truly believe that. Because we're not judges of men. But grace was given to that dying thief that day. And, he'll give it to us too. He gives it to all of us. But he doesn't give it to us by the deeds we do. He doesn't give it to us by the deeds we do, but by our faith in him. Amen.